In the heart of the unforgiving frontier, survival means adapting or perishing. When a brutal winter traps a family on the edge of the wilderness, they must rely on ingenuity, resilience, and each other to face the wild's relentless fury. But as the storm intensifies, a haunting secret from the past threatens their very survival. Before we dive deeper into this story, let us know where you're watching from. If these raw, untold tales of the frontier move you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode will uncover even darker mysteries hidden in the wilderness. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was a pale winter blue, and the next, dark clouds amassed above the cabin like a tidal wave ready to strike. Mila, a seasoned frontier woman with weathered eyes and a quiet strength, stood at the edge of her cabin door. Snowflakes swirled around her like a blizzard, the icy wind biting at her skin. Her thick fur-lined coat, fur cap, and heavy gloves offered little comfort against the relentless cold. Behind her, her children huddled near the warmth of the stove, their faces pale with worry. She had lived through worse winters before, but this one felt different. The wind howled louder than ever before, and the snow drifted faster, burying the land in a thick, unyielding blanket. Her youngest, Emily, pressed her small face against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. The older child, Eli, clutched a wooden toy soldier, his face tight with concern. Mila could see the fear in their eyes. It was the same fear she had felt as a girl, an inevitable part of the frontier life. The cold had crept in, infiltrating even the hearth, which flickered weakly in the corner. Mila knew it wouldn't last long. Her mind raced as she checked the supplies one more time. Flour, salted meat, dried herbs, and water. It wasn't much. They'd have to ration carefully. The wind howled again, and her heart skipped a beat. Something else was out there, something more than the storm. "I'll go check the traps, Tom," she said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of the task ahead. Her children looked at her with wide eyes, but they said nothing. They knew better than to protest. Mila grabbed the rifle that rested on the wall. The storm was already testing her endurance. The wilderness wasn't known for mercy. She had always told her children that the frontier was as beautiful as it was cruel, and now, as the wind battered the cabin's wooden walls, she understood that truth more than ever. The wind lifted, and as Mila opened the door, the cold hit her like a slap. Her breath froze instantly in the air. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the door shut behind her, leaving the warmth of the cabin and her children behind, stepping out into the stark white expanse. Mila trudged through the thick snow, each step sinking deeper into the icy drifts. The wind cut through her coat, biting at her exposed skin. Despite the biting cold, her movements were deliberate, purposeful. She was used to the sting of winter on her body, but today it felt as if the wilderness itself was conspiring against her. Her breath misted in front of her, and the sight of her own exhale was a reminder of how little time they had. Time before the storm buried them, time before the world outside became unrecognizable. The air smelled sharp, like the frost was alive, waiting to claim what it could. As she approached the traps, she glanced back toward the cabin, now barely visible behind a veil of snow. The storm was picking up speed, and her heart raced. The trap line wasn't far from the cabin, but the snow was falling so fast now that she felt disoriented, the world around her becoming a blur of white. A soft rustling sound caught her attention, and she froze. A movement in the snow. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle at her side, her fingers brushing the stock. She turned slowly, scanning the white wilderness. For a brief moment, everything was still. The cold wind howled, but in the distance, something moved again. She strained her eyes through the storm. There, barely visible, was a figure, a person or something else, standing motionless just beyond the tree line. Her heart clenched. Was it a traveler, someone lost in the storm, or was it something far more dangerous? Her grip tightened on the rifle, but before she could make a move, the figure turned and vanished into the swirling snow. The storm had swallowed it whole. Mila stood frozen for a moment, uncertainty gnawing at her. She had heard stories of desperate men lost in the wild, driven mad by hunger or fear. But this felt different. Her instincts, honed by years of living in the wilderness, told her that something darker was out there, watching. The wind did not let up. It never did when it was truly angry. Mila returned to the cabin, her legs stiff from trudging through the snow, the rifle still tightly gripped in her hands. The door slammed behind her as she entered, a gust of icy air escaping into the warmth she'd left behind. She glanced over at Eli and Emily, who were now seated near the stove, bundled under every blanket they could find. The fire had grown dim in her absence, the wood crackling faintly, but it wasn't enough. She could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, suffocating them slowly. "Mama, what did you see?" Eli asked quietly, his eyes wide, as he looked up from his toy soldier. There was no mistaking the fear in his voice. Mila hesitated, glancing at the window that was clouded with frost. She could see nothing through the thick veil of snow outside. She shook her head, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "It was nothing," she said, her voice steady but strained. "Just the wind, making shadows. You should stay inside and keep close to the fire." Eli nodded, but the uncertainty in his eyes lingered. Emily, on the other hand, looked up at her mother with quiet, knowing eyes. She didn't ask questions, but there was something in her gaze, something old, something beyond her years. Mila couldn't help but feel that her daughter knew more about the land than most people would ever understand. The wilderness had a way of shaping souls, especially the young ones. She grabbed a handful of dried wood from the corner and tossed it into the stove, watching the flames grow. The crackling sound filled the silence, but it did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. She was still thinking about what she'd seen, if it had even been real. That figure. It had moved too quickly, vanishing like smoke. It was no animal she knew, and it was too tall to be one of the trappers who occasionally passed through. The thought gnawed at her as she huddled beside her children. She needed to focus on the now, on surviving. There would be time to figure out the rest when the storm passed. If the storm passed. She turned her attention back to the fire, her mind whirling. Her thoughts shifted to her husband, who had been gone for months now, hunting in the mountains. He was the one who had always been the strong one, the one to handle whatever came their way. She was used to the weight of survival, but without him here, it felt heavier than ever. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the cold was creeping in, and Mila could feel it, settling into her bones. It was the kind of cold that made you doubt the warmth of the world. As the evening wore on, the storm seemed to intensify, the howling wind drowning out any sound beyond the cabin's walls. Mila and the children had eaten the last of the bread for dinner, and now they huddled together in silence, waiting for sleep. The fire had finally stabilized, but it was a fleeting warmth, one that would never truly fend off the cold, gnawing at their hearts. Mila didn't sleep. Instead, she sat up in the dark, the glow from the fire casting long shadows against the walls. Her fingers traced the familiar outline of the small wooden chest she kept tucked away in the corner. Inside was everything she had left of the life before the frontier, letters from her family, trinkets, and photographs, things that had once seemed so precious. Now they were little more than ghosts. She could hear the soft, rhythmic breaths of her children as they lay close to each other on the small bed, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to a past she couldn't escape. Her fingers gripped the chest, and for a brief moment she almost opened it, almost allowed herself the luxury of remembering what it was like to be someone else, to have a life without this constant tension in her chest, without the brutal wilderness creeping at her door. But that was before. That was before she had come here, before the land had swallowed so much of her past. She could hear her husband's voice in her mind, his steady, reassuring tone that always seemed to calm her down. He had warned her that the frontier would never be kind, that it would test them both. And it had, every single day. But it wasn't just the land that had shaped her. It was the people who had come and gone, the trappers, the traders, the men who had passed through like fleeting shadows. They had all left their mark on her in some way, but none more than the man who had been the first to teach her the true meaning of survival. Her mind wandered back to that time, years ago, when she first arrived in the wilderness with her husband. It hadn't been long after their wedding, and she had been naive, thinking that she could handle whatever came their way. It hadn't taken long for the land to break her. In those first months, they had lost more than they could ever regain. But through it all, there had been a man, an old trapper, with eyes like steel and a heart made of stone, who had helped them. He had shown them how to build, how to endure, and most importantly, how to survive. He had been everything she needed when her world had seemed too vast and too wild to understand. And then, just as quickly, he had disappeared. His memory haunted her now, like a ghost she could never quite shake. The wind outside picked up again, and Mila closed her eyes, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. She had survived this far. She would survive whatever came next, but she could feel it in her bones, the coldness of the wilderness closing in. The storm was not just a storm, it was a warning. By the time dawn crept through the thick snowfall, Mila was already awake. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, and the chill of the morning had settled in, making her breath fog in the air. She pulled on her woolen shawl and stepped carefully over her sleeping children, her movements deliberate, trying not to wake them. The storm raged outside, but the morning light provided a false sense of calm. She grabbed her rifle and slowly opened the door. The cold immediately wrapped itself around her, sharp and biting. The wind had softened, but the snow had piled high, making every step a struggle. Mila knew she had to check the traps again, though she wasn't sure why. A sense of unease gnawed at her gut, as though the wilderness itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Every instinct told her to stay close to the cabin, to protect her children and wait out the storm. But something had pulled her outside. The memory of the figure she had seen the day before haunted her thoughts. It hadn't been a shadow or a trick of the wind. No, it was something real, and it was still out there. The cabin was far enough from the nearby ridge that no one should have been near, yet the presence of the figure had lingered in her mind like a stain. Her heart pounded as she moved through the snow, her footsteps muffled in the soft, thick drifts. She reached the trap line, but the traps were empty, just as they had been when she last checked. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind her, a soft crunch of snow beneath heavy boots. Mila's heart lurched, and before she could even raise the rifle, a figure emerged from the swirling white fog. A man. His silhouette was barely visible through the storm, but the tall frame, thick furs, and grim expression made it clear that he wasn't a traveler passing through. "Stay back," Mila called out, her voice sharp, but the words were almost lost in the wind. She raised the rifle, aiming it directly at the figure. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he held his hands out, palms facing her in a gesture of peace. "I mean, you no harm," he said, his voice deep, rough. "I've lost my way in the storm. I can't go another step without help." Mila's fingers tightened around the rifle, but something in the stranger's eyes made her hesitate. There was a certain desperation in his face, a weariness that echoed her own. She lowered the rifle slightly but didn't relax her grip. "How did you find me?" she asked, her tone cautious, but not without a trace of curiosity. "I was following tracks," the man replied. "Saw your smoke last night. Thought I might find shelter here." Mila eyed him suspiciously. The storm had been relentless, and it seemed impossible that anyone could have traveled so far through the snow. Yet there he was, standing before her. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ben Caldwell." Mila nodded slowly, still wary. Ben Caldwell wasn't a name she recognized, but the wilderness was full of strangers, many of them with good reason to keep their pasts hidden. "Come inside, then. You'll freeze if you stand out here much longer." Ben nodded, stepping gingerly toward her, and as they entered the cabin, Mila could feel her sense of unease deepening. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she wasn't sure what other choice she had. As Ben stepped over the threshold and into the warmth of the cabin, Mila caught a glimpse of something glinting in the snow behind him, something metallic, something sharp. She looked again, but the storm had already swallowed the evidence. The stranger's presence brought more questions than answers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something far darker had just walked into her home. Ben sat by the fire, his damp clothes steaming as he warmed himself. Mila watched him carefully from across the room, her eyes flicking between him and her children. Eli had crept closer to the fire, trying to keep the warmth close, but his gaze kept darting back to the strange man sitting in their midst. Emily, ever silent, had moved quietly to Mila's side, clutching her small doll. Mila's instincts told her that there was something wrong, but her practical side knew she couldn't send him back into the storm. The wilderness had claimed far too many lives, and she wasn't about to let another one fall to it if she could help it. Yet every part of her screamed that he was hiding something. "Where do you come from?" Mila asked, keeping her tone neutral. "And what's your business in these parts?" Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands resting on his knees. His face was tired, rough, as though he had been traveling for days. His eyes darted briefly to the children and then back to Mila, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm a trapper," he said, his voice low. "Been out on my own for a while now. Lost my bearings in the storm. Didn't mean to intrude." Mila didn't buy it. She had known too many trappers to believe that story. They weren't so careless as to lose their way in a storm unless something else was at play. She studied him for a moment, her mind working quickly. There was something about him, something about his stillness, that reminded her of a predator, watching carefully, waiting for the right moment to strike. She pushed the thought away. She needed him for now. "You can stay the night," she said, her voice firm, "but in the morning you'll be on your way." Ben nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He looked down at the fire, and for a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the flames. The wind howled outside, but in the cabin, the silence felt suffocating. Then, just as Mila turned to check on the children, Ben's voice broke through the quiet. "You're not alone out here, are you?" The words hit her like a slap. She spun around, her heart racing, her hand reaching for the rifle. But Ben was already looking at her with a strange, knowing expression, his gaze piercing through the shadows of the cabin. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice low. "Someone's been following me. I'm not sure who, but they've been shadowing me for days. I thought I lost them before I came here, but I'm not so sure." Mila's heart skipped. The snowstorm outside was relentless, but now there was something even more unsettling than the weather. Someone was out there, and they were much closer than she had realized. The wind outside howled like a pack of wolves on the hunt, relentless and cold. Mila had taken her place beside the stove, her eyes scanning the fire, but her mind was far from calm. Ben's words about being followed echoed in her head. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced at the door, then at the small window high above the cabin. The storm was still fierce, but the eerie silence of the night only made it worse. Ben had fallen asleep by the fire, his face slack with exhaustion. His coat, now drying on a nearby chair, hung heavy with the weight of the snow that had clung to it when he'd arrived. Mila's gaze flickered between him and the door, where the shadows outside danced with the gusts of snow. The cabin felt more like a trap than a shelter. Eli and Emily slept soundly, unaware of the tension in the air. Mila had made sure of that, tucking them under every blanket she could find, ensuring their warmth and safety, but she could feel the quiet fear settling in her chest. The presence of a stranger was unsettling enough, but the possibility of someone following him was worse. She had known enough of the frontier to understand that danger often came from the least expected places. The fire crackled, and a piece of wood snapped, sending sparks flying. Mila stood up, moving quietly to the window. She carefully pulled aside the small curtain just enough to peer out into the storm. The world beyond was a sea of white, the snow falling in sheets, blurring the line between the earth and the sky. No movement, no sign of life. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting. She pulled away from the window, her hands cold against the glass. As she did, her eyes caught sight of Ben's coat again, draped over the chair. His rifle was leaning against the wall beside it, just out of reach. The thought made her heart race. What was his real intent? He had been so quick to claim he was just lost in the storm, but Mila knew better than to trust a man who arrived with no warning, especially in these parts. Suddenly, a sound cut through the stillness, a soft, scraping noise from the door followed by the faintest knock. Mila froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood motionless, listening intently. Another knock, closer this time. Her instincts screamed at her to wake Ben, but she didn't dare. Her children were too close. They couldn't afford to make a sound. Mila moved silently toward the door, her hand reaching for the rifle she'd placed by the hearth. Her breath was shallow, controlled. The knock came again, more urgent this time. She raised the rifle, the cold wood against her fingers, and hesitated. Who could it be? Her thoughts raced as she carefully lifted the latch, pushing the door open just enough to see beyond the frame. Nothing, just the wind, the snow. But then she saw it, a set of large, wet footprints leading away from the cabin and into the forest. The tracks were fresh, still pressed deep into the snow. Mila's heart sank. Someone had been here, and whoever it was, they hadn't left. The door slammed shut, and Mila's pulse thundered in her ears. She didn't have to think twice. She grabbed her coat, bundled it tightly around her, and moved toward the rifle. Ben stirred as she passed him, his eyes blinking open just enough to catch her fleeting motion. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice groggy. "Stay inside with the children," Mila ordered, her voice a low whisper, but firm enough to leave no room for argument. "I'll be back soon." Ben's gaze followed her as she pulled the door open once more, stepping into the howling snowstorm. The bitter cold slapped her face immediately, and the wind carried a sharp sting that made her eyes water. She pulled the fur-lined hood tighter over her head, her breath coming out in visible puffs, and squinted into the storm. The footprints were still there, a clear path cutting through the snow. Mila knew the land well enough to understand that the person who had left them wasn't trying to hide. They were trying to be found. The tracks led away from the cabin toward the thick forest beyond. With a steady hand, Mila grasped her rifle, the weight of it familiar and comforting. The sound of her boots crunching in the snow was all that could be heard above the roar of the wind. She moved cautiously, taking slow, measured steps toward the tree line. The storm had covered the tracks in places, but she was able to follow them by the indentations in the snow and the occasional fallen branch disturbed by the weight of the footsteps. As she moved deeper into the forest, the landscape changed. The trees grew denser, their branches heavy with snow, blocking out the little light the storm had left behind. The world had become a blanket of white, with no sign of life. No birds, no animals, no sounds of the wilderness that usually filled the silence. Her breath came faster as the realization settled in. Whoever was out here, they were waiting for something, for her. The tracks continued, but now they were joined by other prints, smaller, lighter, almost hidden beneath the snow, but unmistakable. Mila's heart skipped a beat. There was more than one person out here. She hesitated, her hand tightening on the rifle. It had to be a trap. It didn't matter who had followed Ben. It mattered that they were now in her territory, and the wilderness didn't tolerate trespassers. She followed the tracks for what felt like hours, the storm battering her, the cold seeping deep into her bones. But still she pressed on, knowing that she couldn't go back until she found answers. Her children were waiting for her, and she wasn't going to let anyone harm them, not while she had the power to stop it. And then, through the snow, she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, watching her every move. Mila's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her rifle raised, her breath shallow in the biting cold. The figure ahead of her remained still, half hidden behind the trunks of the snow-laden trees, the faint outlines of its form barely visible against the storm. The snow fell heavily around them, but the stillness in the forest felt unnatural, as if the wilderness itself was holding its breath. She took another step, her boots crunching in the snow with an almost deafening sound. The figure didn't move. Mila's hand tightened on her rifle. Every instinct screamed for caution. Her eyes darted to the trees surrounding her, seeking the slightest sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the endless, swirling snow. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. It echoed through the trees, carried away by the wind, before it could fully reach the figure. Her voice was swallowed by the storm, but it didn't matter. The person, whoever it was already watching her, waiting. "I mean no harm," a low voice responded from the shadows. It was deep, strained, as if the man had been shouting into the storm for hours. "Just came for some shelter, like you." Mila didn't lower the rifle. She had heard those words before from people who weren't what they seemed. She knew better than to trust anyone who wandered out in these parts without warning, especially in a storm like this. She kept her stance firm, her eyes narrowing. "You came out here in this?" Mila asked, keeping her tone sharp. "For shelter? No one's lost out here by accident." The figure shifted, stepping slightly into the open, but still keeping his distance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in layers of weathered furs and cloth. He wore a hat pulled low over his face, obscuring most of his features, but Mila could see the weariness in his posture, the tightness in his movements. "I didn't come out here by accident," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I'm just looking for someone. Thought I'd find them in this storm." Mila's pulse quickened. Her instincts told her to retreat, to turn back and get to her children, but something held her in place. The man's words, though vague, resonated with her. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. "Who are you looking for?" she asked, the words slipping from her mouth before she could stop them. "You won't find anyone out here in this storm. You'd be better off heading back to the cabin." The man's expression softened slightly, his shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. He took another cautious step forward. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, his voice quieter now. "A woman named Mila." Mila's breath caught in her throat, her mind raced, and the world seemed to slow. It was too much of a coincidence. She had heard that name before, a long time ago, a name that had been buried beneath years of hardship and survival. But there was no time to think about it now. The snow was falling harder, the wind whipping through the trees like a furious beast. Mila took a step back, keeping the rifle trained on him. "Go back to where you came from," she said, her voice hardening. "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but I'm not interested in your business." The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a few slow, deliberate steps toward her, his gaze unwavering. "I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," he murmured. Mila's grip tightened on the rifle, and for a moment time seemed to stretch between them. The wind howled, and the snow swirled around them in a dense fog. In that instant, she realized something she had feared all along. The wilderness had brought him here, whether by chance or design, and he was no stranger. He was someone from her past. But was he a threat, or was he here to bring answers? The storm raged, the wind screaming through the trees, but Mila stood still, her rifle raised, her gaze locked on the man in front of her. She couldn't afford to show weakness. She had her children to protect, her life to defend, but his words, his insistence, made her hesitate. "I don't know who you are," she said slowly, the grip on her rifle never wavering. "And I don't care. If you've come here for trouble, you'll get none from me." The man nodded as if he understood her distrust. Then, in the thick silence between them, he pulled off his hat and stepped closer, just enough for her to see his face clearly for the first time. Mila's breath hitched. There, in the dim light of the storm, was the face of someone she thought she had lost forever. A man she hadn't seen in years, a man who had vanished without a trace, a ghost from her past standing before her. It was her brother, Jonah. "Mila," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's me, Jonah." Mila took an involuntary step back, shock seizing her chest. Her mind reeled as memories of a time long gone flooded her. Jonah had left the family when she was just a girl, going off to trap in the northern reaches of the wilderness. He'd promised he'd return, but after a few years the letters stopped, and then he disappeared entirely. Her family had mourned him, thought him dead. But here he was, alive, standing in front of her with that same worn, weathered look of a man who had lived too many lifetimes in too few years. How is this possible?" Mila whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "I'm sorry," Jonah said, his voice full of regret. "I didn't mean to disappear, Mila. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was keeping you safe. Moo. But it seems I've only made things worse." Mila's heart ached with the weight of his words, but she couldn't bring herself to drop her guard just yet. The man standing in front of her wasn't just a ghost from her past. He was a man hardened by the wilderness, just as she had become, and she had no idea what kind of story he had to tell. "What happened?" Mila asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back?" Jonah's eyes grew dark, and for the first time Mila saw the full weight of the pain he had been carrying. He glanced around them, as if making sure no one else was watching, before he spoke in a low, haunted voice. "There's something out here," he said. "Something darker than the storm. Something that's been hunting me. And now it's coming for you, too." Mila's blood ran cold as the realization sank in. She wasn't just facing the wilderness. She was facing something much more terrifying. Something that had followed Jonah, and now it had found its way to her door. The storm had come, but it wasn't the only thing howling in the wind.